For years, there's been a huge debate about which version of Aladdin is the best. Well, you're in luck, because today I'm here to set the record straight on this highly controversial topic. The best version of Aladdin is the Sega Master System. Oh, and I guess also sort of the Game Gear, but we'll get to that in a minute. That's right, for my money, the Master System version of Aladdin is the best adaptation of the film. Is the Genesis version better looking? I mean, of course it is. But that doesn't mean that the Master System version doesn't have its charms. Does the SNES game play better? Yeah, probably, but while it's fun, it doesn't really evoke the movie in the same way. So if it's not the best looking and it's not the best playing, then why is it the best, you might ask? It's a fair question. For me personally, I think it's the best because it follows the movie much more closely than either of the other games, and it stays truer to the characters and story as well. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. First off, the Master System game has no weapons, minus maybe 10 rocks you find along the way, and a sword on the final boss. You're not constantly cutting dudes up or knocking bats out of the sky with a huge stockpile of apples. For the most part, it's just platforming to avoid enemies, which feels a lot more in keeping with Aladdin's character from the film. The next big thing for me is level design. The Master System game is more simple, almost by necessity, since it's on an 8-bit system, but the levels feel more like their film counterparts. There are no archers, no random collectibles, no confusing Earthworm Jim style level design, and no end-of-stage lottery system. There's just simple, basic platforming with nothing to break up the flow of the game. Then there's the way it tells the story. In both the SNES and the Genesis version, they tell the story via still pictures. Granted, the still pictures are very nice looking for the time, but I think the Master System's use of in-game assets with little animation flourishes really does a lot better job of telling the story in a way that's not just remembering what happened in the movie, but seeing it again in a new way. For example, let's take a look at the balcony scene on all 3 consoles. First up, the Genesis is basically just a text crawl by a narrator. Nothing too exciting. Next we have the SNES. It's a nice picture and a decent original song here, but again it's very static. Now let's take a look at the Master System. Sadly, it doesn't have any music during this scene, but I think it shows how much more work was put into telling the story. Okay, so comparisons aside, what is it that I enjoy about this game so much? I think ultimately it's how well it all comes together. I'd say without a doubt it's one of the better looking games on the Master System. The music is full of really great 8-bit versions of all the songs from the movies, and most importantly, it doesn't overstay its welcome. It just has a great flow. It's not overly difficult, and once you know what you're doing, it's probably only about 45 minutes or so from beginning to end, which makes it a great game to come back to every few years. Alright, so there's a lot to love about this game, but it's not without a few drawbacks. First off, let's talk about the difference between the Master System and the Game Gear versions. On a base level, they're identical. I played through both, and as far as I can tell, the only real difference is resolution, but that's a huge difference in this game. Let's take the first level, for example. It's a good place to show off the problem because it's an auto-scroller. On the Master System version, it can be tricky to dodge a few of the pots that drop from the sky, but all in all, it's not too tough. On the Game Gear, however, the view distance is so much smaller that you have to react in a much shorter time for all of the obstacles, and some of the obstacles you can't see at all, resulting in hits that feel cheap and unfair. It's a problem that happens all through the game and makes it much more difficult and frustrating as a result. For this reason, I'd highly suggest the Master System version if you have the option. Now let's talk about the things I didn't like in the game itself. Basically, there are 2 kinds of levels in this game: auto-scrolling and exploration. For the most part, the auto-scrollers are no problem. Maybe you'll get tripped up once or twice on a tricky part, but the game has unlimited lives and pretty generous checkpoints, so even if you make a mistake, you're out like 30 seconds of playtime max. The exploration levels, however, have a lot of little problems. One of the biggest stumbling blocks is that there are 2 moves you can do in the game that are not explained anywhere except in the game's manual. So if you don't have the manual, then you can get stuck at certain parts. For example, in the second level, there is a low cave area that you can't pass. Now I've played this game before, so I sorta knew what I had to do, but it still took me a few tries to figure out the right button combination to slide. It's a small thing, but if you can't figure it out, then you can't progress, which can be frustrating. The second move is a sneaking move which you need to use to pass some spikes on the ground in certain stages. You have to hold down and press the 2 button to take each step. Without knowing this move, there is at least one key that you can't get, which makes that level impossible to finish. It's easy enough to look up online these days, but that's not really great design. Okay, I have just a few more small things that I want to talk about before I wrap up. In the palace level, it can be pretty hard to see some of the switches you have to hit in order to move on. Not only that, but those doors look just like the keyed ones, so if you don't notice the switch, you can go all over looking for a key that just doesn't exist. Another small thing is lining up with a ledge in order to climb it. It uses a very Prince of Persia control scheme here, and if you're not lined up just right, then Aladdin won't climb it. Adjust yourself back an imperceptible amount and then try again, and he climbs right up. Again, not a deal breaker, but a little fiddly. The last thing I want to talk about is in a few of the stages, there are these falling rocks that are obscured by the foreground, and while some are visible beforehand, others are not. So they're basically just cheap hits that you can only avoid if you already know they're coming because you've played the level before. It doesn't end up being a huge deal because the game is pretty generous with health items, and lives are unlimited, but it can be a little frustrating to just get hit randomly. Okay, so that just about covers it. I've made my case for the game. Even if you think I'm crazy and you enjoy one of the other versions more, I still hope that you'll give the Master System game a shot. I never see anyone talk about it, and I feel like most people think it's just going to be a cut-down version of the Genesis game, so they never give it a shot. But ultimately, I think it's a game that stands on its own and is worth your time. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.